they called it kitchen madness. No military nutritionist, no food scientist, no supply officer believed that Sergeant First Class Tommy "Spoon" Rodriguez could preserve fresh meat and vegetables for 6 months using nothing but salt, smoke, and what he called his grandmother's secret. The manual said field rations lasted 2 weeks maximum before spoilage made them dangerous to eat. But when the American garrison on remote Attu Island in the Aleutians got cut off from supply ships for half a year, Tommy's stupid food preservation methods were all that stood between 2,400 American soldiers and starvation. Tommy looked at the dwindling supply depot, calculated the math of survival, and made a decision that would violate every food safety regulation in the Army cookbook. He was going to preserve 6 months' worth of food using techniques his Mexican grandmother had taught him in a kitchen in San Antonio, techniques that had kept his family fed during the Great Depression when store-bought food was a luxury they couldn't afford. What happened next would challenge everything the military thought they knew about field nutrition, prove that innovation often comes from the most unexpected sources, and demonstrate that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most effective ones. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These accounts reveal how American resourcefulness and cultural knowledge saved lives in impossible circumstances. The fog rolled thick and gray across Attu Island, the westernmost point of Alaska and one of the most isolated American military positions in the Pacific Theater. The island was a desolate place of volcanic rock, constant wind, and weather that could change from clear skies to blizzard conditions in minutes. For the 2,400 American soldiers stationed there, Attu was both a strategic outpost and a test of human endurance. Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez, 31 years old from San Antonio, Texas, stood in the garrison's main mess hall surveying the food supplies that were supposed to last until the next supply convoy arrived. Tommy had been the head cook for the Attu garrison for 8 months, responsible for feeding over 2,000 men 3 meals a day under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Tommy's background was different from most Army cooks. Before the war, he had worked in his family's restaurant in San Antonio, learning traditional Mexican cooking techniques from his grandmother, Maria Rodriguez, who had emigrated from Michoacán in the 1890s. Maria had survived the Mexican Revolution, the influenza pandemic of 1918, and the Great Depression by knowing how to make food last when times were hard and money was scarce. The techniques Maria had taught Tommy weren't found in any military manual or nutritionist's textbook. They were folk knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned to survive by making the most of whatever food they could get and making it last as long as possible. Tommy had adapted these traditional methods to military cooking, using them to improve the taste and nutritional value of standard Army rations. His innovations had made him popular with the troops, who appreciated meals that tasted like real food instead of the bland, institutional cooking they expected from military mess halls. But now Tommy faced a challenge that would test every technique his grandmother had taught him and require innovations that went far beyond anything he had attempted before. The emergency that changed everything. The radio message that arrived on October 15, 1943, was brief and devastating in its implications. A major storm system in the North Pacific had damaged several supply ships and forced the postponement of all resupply missions to the Aleutian Islands indefinitely. The Attu garrison, which had been expecting a supply convoy within the week, would have to survive on existing food stores for an unknown period that could extend to 6 months or more. Tommy did the mathematics immediately. The garrison had approximately 3 weeks' worth of standard rations remaining, plus emergency supplies that might extend their food for another 2 weeks. After that, 2,400 American soldiers would begin starving on one of the most remote and inhospitable islands in the world. Colonel James Patterson, the garrison commander, called an emergency meeting of all department heads to assess the situation and develop survival strategies. The options were limited and none of them were good. The garrison could attempt to supplement their food supplies by fishing and hunting the limited wildlife on the island, but Attu's harsh climate and barren landscape offered few opportunities for obtaining significant amounts of food. Rationing could extend the existing food supplies, but even severe rationing would only delay starvation by a few weeks. The garrison could attempt to radio for an emergency airlift of supplies, but weather conditions made flying to Attu extremely dangerous, and the Air Force could not guarantee the ability to deliver adequate food supplies by air. When Colonel Patterson asked for suggestions, most of the officers focused on rationing strategies and emergency hunting plans. But Tommy raised his hand and made a proposal that stunned everyone in the room. "Sir, I can preserve the food we have and make it last 6 months," Tommy said quietly. The room fell silent. Captain Robert Morrison, the garrison's supply officer, was the first to respond. "Sergeant, that's impossible. Food spoilage is a basic biological process. You can't prevent it with kitchen equipment." "With respect, sir," Tommy replied, "I think I can." Tommy's proposal was based on traditional preservation techniques that had been used for centuries before refrigeration and chemical preservatives. He wanted to use salt curing, smoking, dehydration, and fermentation to transform the garrison's remaining fresh food supplies into preserved foods that could remain edible for months. The techniques were time-tested and scientifically sound, but they had never been applied on the scale Tommy was proposing. He was talking about preserving enough food to sustain over 2,000 men for 6 months, using only the equipment and materials available in a military mess hall on a remote island. Colonel Patterson was skeptical but desperate. "Sergeant Rodriguez, if you think you can do this, you have my permission to try. But understand that if you're wrong, you'll be responsible for the starvation of this entire garrison." Tommy understood the stakes perfectly. But he also understood something that the other officers didn't: his grandmother's techniques had kept his family alive during times when failure meant death. He was betting the lives of 2,400 American soldiers on knowledge passed down through generations of people who had survived by making food last when there was no other choice. The preservation revolution begins. Tommy began his food preservation project the next morning, working with a team of volunteer cooks and kitchen staff who understood that their efforts would determine whether the garrison survived the winter. The scale of the project was unprecedented. They needed to preserve thousands of pounds of meat, vegetables, and other perishable foods using only traditional techniques and improvised equipment. Tommy's first priority was meat preservation, since protein was the most critical nutritional component and the most likely to spoil quickly. The garrison had substantial quantities of fresh beef, pork, and chicken that would normally be consumed within days. Using techniques his grandmother had taught him, Tommy began the process of transforming this fresh meat into preserved foods that could last for months. The salt curing process required precise ratios of salt to meat and careful control of temperature and humidity. Tommy had his team construct curing chambers using wooden crates lined with cheesecloth and positioned to take advantage of Attu's constant wind for air circulation. The meat was cut into specific sizes and coated with salt mixtures that included not just sodium chloride but also saltpeter and other preservatives that Tommy had learned to make from materials available in the mess hall. The smoking process was more complex, requiring the construction of smokehouses using materials salvaged from other parts of the garrison. Tommy's team built large smoking chambers using metal sheeting, wooden frameworks, and improvised ventilation systems. The smoking process required maintaining specific temperatures for extended periods while exposing the meat to smoke from particular types of wood that would provide both preservation and flavor. Tommy's knowledge of traditional Mexican preservation techniques proved invaluable in adapting these processes to the materials and conditions available on Attu. He knew which combinations of salt and spices would provide the best preservation effects, how to control the smoking process to achieve maximum preservation without overdrying the meat, and how to test the preserved foods to ensure they remained safe to eat. But the most innovative aspect of Tommy's preservation program was his adaptation of traditional fermentation techniques to preserve vegetables and other foods that couldn't be effectively salt-cured or smoked. Using knowledge his grandmother had taught him about making pickled vegetables and fermented sauces, Tommy developed methods for preserving the garrison's vegetable supplies using controlled fermentation processes. The fermentation required careful control of acidity, salt concentration, and temperature to ensure that beneficial bacteria would preserve the vegetables while preventing the growth of harmful microorganisms. Tommy's team constructed fermentation vessels using available containers and created controlled environments where the fermentation process could proceed safely and effectively. The science behind traditional wisdom. What Tommy understood, and what many military nutritionists did not, was that traditional food preservation techniques were based on sound scientific principles that had been proven effective through centuries of use. Salt curing worked by creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive, while beneficial preservation processes could continue. Smoking provided both dehydration and chemical preservation through compounds in wood smoke that had antimicrobial properties. Fermentation was perhaps the most sophisticated of Tommy's techniques, relying on controlled bacterial processes that created acidic environments hostile to harmful microorganisms while producing preserved foods that retained much of their nutritional value. Tommy's grandmother had taught him to recognize the signs of proper fermentation and to distinguish between beneficial fermentation and dangerous spoilage. These traditional techniques had several advantages over the chemical preservation methods used in military rations. They required no artificial preservatives or specialized equipment, they could be implemented using materials available in any kitchen, and they often improved the nutritional value of foods rather than degrading it. Tommy's adaptation of these techniques to military-scale preservation required innovations in equipment design and process control, but the fundamental principles remained the same. He was essentially scaling up kitchen techniques that had been used successfully for generations, applying them to quantities and timelines that no one had attempted before. The other advantage of Tommy's approach was that it produced foods that actually tasted good, unlike many military rations that were nutritionally adequate but unpalatable. Tommy understood that maintaining morale through good food was almost as important as maintaining nutrition through adequate food, especially during the psychological stress of isolation and potential starvation. His preserved meats retained flavor and texture that made them enjoyable to eat rather than merely tolerable. His fermented vegetables provided vitamins and minerals while adding variety and taste to meals that could have become monotonous during months of rationing. Most importantly, Tommy's techniques were flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. If one preservation method failed or if new food supplies became available, the techniques could be modified or combined to meet new requirements. The first month's success and skepticism. By mid-November, Tommy's preservation efforts had transformed the garrison's food situation dramatically. What had been 3 weeks' worth of perishable food had become the foundation for a preservation program that was producing steadily increasing quantities of shelf-stable preserved foods. The salt-cured meats were developing properly, showing no signs of spoilage while maintaining nutritional value and developing the characteristic flavors and textures of properly preserved foods. The smoking process was producing dried meats that could be stored indefinitely and reconstituted for cooking or eaten directly as high-protein rations. The fermented vegetables were perhaps the most impressive success of Tommy's program. Using traditional techniques adapted to available materials, Tommy had created fermented vegetable products that not only preserved the original vegetables but actually enhanced their nutritional value through the fermentation process. But not everyone was convinced that Tommy's methods would continue to work over the long term. Captain Morrison remained skeptical about the safety and reliability of preservation techniques that weren't backed by formal scientific testing. Several officers worried that the garrison was taking unnecessary risks by relying on folk knowledge rather than established military food safety protocols. The medical officer, Major David Chen, was particularly concerned about the potential for food poisoning from improperly preserved foods. He pointed out that traditional preservation techniques, while historically effective, had also been responsible for foodborne illnesses when not executed properly. Tommy understood these concerns and implemented testing and quality control procedures to ensure the safety of his preserved foods. He trained his kitchen staff to recognize signs of spoilage or improper preservation and established protocols for testing foods before they were served to the troops. The testing revealed that Tommy's preserved foods were not only safe but often more nutritious than the original fresh foods. The fermentation processes had increased the vitamin content of vegetables, while the preservation processes had concentrated proteins and other nutrients in the preserved meats. Perhaps most importantly, the troops were responding positively to Tommy's preserved foods. Instead of the declining morale that typically accompanied extended periods of rationing, the garrison was maintaining good spirits partly because they were eating food that tasted good and provided variety in their diet. The success of the first month's preservation efforts gave Tommy confidence to expand his techniques and experiment with new approaches to food preservation that could further extend the garrison's food supplies. The innovation that saved winter. As winter set in on Attu Island and the weather made resupply even more unlikely, Tommy faced new challenges that required additional innovations in food preservation and nutrition management. The extreme cold and limited daylight created conditions that were both helpful and problematic for his preservation efforts. The cold temperatures helped with some preservation processes by slowing bacterial growth and providing natural refrigeration for foods that were in various stages of preservation. But the cold also made it more difficult to maintain the specific temperatures required for optimal preservation processes, and the limited daylight reduced the garrison's ability to supplement their preserved foods with fresh fish or other local food sources. Tommy's response was to develop what he called winter preservation techniques that took advantage of Attu's harsh climate while compensating for its limitations. He created outdoor preservation areas where the constant cold could be used for natural refrigeration of foods that were being prepared for long-term preservation. The most innovative of Tommy's winter techniques was his development of garrison pemmican, a concentrated survival food based on traditional Native American preservation methods that Tommy had learned about from his grandmother's stories about indigenous food preservation. Pemmican combined dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries into a high-calorie, high-protein food that could be stored indefinitely and provided complete nutrition for people engaged in heavy physical activity. Tommy's garrison pemmican used the preserved meats from his salt curing and smoking operations, combined with rendered fats saved from cooking operations and dried vegetables from his fermentation program. The result was a concentrated food that provided maximum nutrition per pound and could sustain soldiers during extended periods when regular meal preparation was not possible. The pemmican proved particularly valuable during severe weather when normal cooking operations were difficult or impossible. Soldiers could carry pemmican rations that provided adequate nutrition without requiring heating or preparation, allowing them to maintain their duties even during the worst weather conditions. Tommy also developed what he called garrison soup concentrate, a dehydrated soup base made from preserved vegetables, meat extracts, and concentrated seasonings that could be reconstituted with hot water to provide hot, nutritious meals even when fresh ingredients were not available. These innovations represented Tommy's most significant departures from traditional preservation techniques, as he was combining elements from different preservation traditions and adapting them to the specific requirements of military nutrition and the extreme conditions on Attu Island. The psychological impact of continued prosperity. By January 1944, 3 months into what many had expected to be a starvation scenario, the Attu garrison was not only surviving but actually thriving under Tommy's food preservation program. The soldiers were maintaining their health, strength, and morale while eating preserved foods that were often more flavorful and varied than the standard military rations they had received during normal supply operations. The psychological impact of Tommy's success extended far beyond simple nutrition. The knowledge that they could survive and even prosper under the most challenging conditions gave the garrison confidence and resilience that affected every aspect of their military effectiveness. Soldiers who had initially been demoralized by the prospect of months of isolation and potential starvation were now taking pride in their garrison's self-sufficiency and innovation. They began referring to themselves as the Attu survivors, and developed a strong esprit de corps based on their shared experience of overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The success of Tommy's preservation program also had strategic implications for the military's understanding of logistics and supply chain management. The Attu garrison had demonstrated that properly trained and equipped units could maintain combat effectiveness even when cut off from normal supply lines for extended periods. This capability was particularly important in the Pacific Theater, where units were often stationed on remote islands with limited resupply options. The knowledge that garrisons could survive extended isolation periods using locally implemented preservation techniques changed planning assumptions for Pacific operations. Tommy's techniques were being documented and studied by military nutritionists and logistics specialists who recognized that his innovations could be applied to other situations where normal supply chains were disrupted or unavailable. But perhaps the most important impact was on Tommy himself and his understanding of the value of traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. His grandmother's techniques, which he had initially viewed as family traditions and cultural curiosities, had proven to be sophisticated and effective solutions to modern problems. The experience reinforced Tommy's appreciation for the wisdom embedded in traditional practices and his understanding that innovation often comes from combining old knowledge with new applications rather than discarding traditional methods in favor of purely modern approaches. The technique spread beyond Attu. Word of Tommy's food preservation success spread through Pacific Theater logistics networks and attracted attention from supply officers and military nutritionists throughout the region. By February 1944, Tommy was receiving requests for information about his techniques from other remote garrisons facing similar supply challenges. The Army Quartermaster Corps dispatched a team of specialists to Attu to document Tommy's methods and assess their applicability to other situations. The specialists were initially skeptical about preservation techniques that weren't based on formal scientific protocols, but their assessment revealed that Tommy's methods were not only effective but often superior to standard military preservation techniques. The traditional techniques Tommy used were based on sound scientific principles, even though they had been developed through empirical observation rather than laboratory research. The specialists found that Tommy's preserved foods often had better nutritional profiles than comparable military rations and significantly better taste and palatability. Most importantly, Tommy's techniques could be implemented using materials and equipment available at any military installation, making them practical for widespread adoption. The techniques didn't require specialized chemicals, expensive equipment, or extensive training, making them accessible to cooks and food service personnel throughout the military. The Quartermaster Corps began developing standardized procedures based on Tommy's innovations, creating training materials that could be used to teach his techniques to cooks at other installations. The procedures were tested at several other remote bases and proved effective in various climates and conditions. Tommy was temporarily assigned to the Quartermaster Corps training facility in San Francisco, where he helped develop curricula for teaching traditional preservation techniques to military food service personnel. His classes became extremely popular among cooks who were eager to learn techniques that could improve the quality and variety of food they could provide to troops. The training programs emphasized not just the mechanical aspects of preservation techniques but also the principles behind them, helping cooks understand why traditional methods worked and how they could be adapted to different circumstances and requirements. Tommy's influence extended beyond military applications to civilian food preservation efforts on the home front. Information about his techniques was shared with civilian food preservation programs that were helping American families cope with wartime rationing and food shortages. The 6-month milestone triumph. March 15, 1944, marked exactly 6 months since the Attu garrison had been cut off from regular supply shipments. What had been expected to be a survival crisis had instead become a demonstration of American resourcefulness and the effectiveness of traditional preservation techniques applied with skill and innovation. The garrison was not only surviving but had actually improved its food situation during the 6 months of isolation. Tommy's preservation techniques had not only made the original food supplies last 6 months but had actually produced more preserved food than the garrison could consume, creating surplus supplies that could sustain them for additional months if necessary. The preserved foods Tommy had created were not emergency rations to be endured but high-quality foods that the troops actively enjoyed eating. The salt-cured meats had developed complex flavors that were superior to many commercial preserved meats. The fermented vegetables provided variety and nutrition that exceeded what had been available in the original fresh vegetables. Most remarkably, the garrison's health and fitness levels had actually improved during the 6 months of preserved food consumption. Medical examinations revealed that the troops were stronger, healthier, and had better nutritional status than when they had been receiving regular supply shipments. The success was due partly to the high nutritional quality of Tommy's preserved foods, but also to the fact that the preservation techniques had forced the garrison to maintain a more varied and balanced diet than the standard military rations typically provided. Colonel Patterson's report to Pacific Theater headquarters described the Attu Garrison's food preservation program as the most successful logistics innovation of the Pacific Campaign. The report emphasized that Tommy's techniques had not only solved an emergency supply problem but had actually improved the garrison's overall capability and effectiveness. The success attracted attention from the highest levels of military command, including General Douglas MacArthur, who was interested in applying Tommy's techniques to other Pacific operations where supply lines were vulnerable to enemy action or natural disasters. Tommy received the Army Commendation Medal for his innovations and was promoted to Master Sergeant in recognition of his contributions to military logistics and troop welfare. But for Tommy, the most important recognition came from the soldiers whose lives his techniques had sustained and whose morale his food had maintained during 6 months of isolation. The soldiers of the Attu garrison had survived not just physically but psychologically, maintaining their effectiveness as a military unit while developing pride in their ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges through American ingenuity and determination. The legacy of practical wisdom. Tommy Rodriguez's food preservation innovations had impacts that extended far beyond the immediate success of keeping the Attu garrison fed for 6 months. His techniques became standard components of military logistics training and were adapted for use in various civilian applications where food preservation was critical for survival or economic reasons. The success of traditional preservation techniques in a modern military context challenged assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and practical effectiveness. Tommy had demonstrated that solutions to modern problems often existed in traditional knowledge that had been developed through generations of practical experience. His work influenced post-war development of military field rations and emergency food supplies, incorporating traditional preservation principles into modern food technology. The combination of traditional techniques with modern understanding of nutrition and food safety produced preserved foods that were superior to purely technological approaches. Tommy's story also highlighted the importance of cultural diversity in military units and the value of drawing on the varied backgrounds and experiences of service members. His Mexican-American heritage and family traditions had provided him with knowledge that proved crucial for military success in ways that no one could have predicted. After the war, Tommy returned to San Antonio where he used his military experience and traditional food knowledge to establish a successful food preservation business that served both civilian and military customers. His company became known for producing high-quality preserved foods that combined traditional techniques with modern safety standards. Tommy continued to teach food preservation techniques to both military and civilian groups, emphasizing the principles behind traditional methods and their applications to modern requirements. His classes attracted students from around the world who were interested in learning sustainable food preservation techniques that didn't rely on industrial processing or chemical preservatives. The techniques Tommy had pioneered on Attu Island were eventually adopted by survival schools, disaster preparedness organizations, and sustainable food movements that recognized the value of preservation methods that could be implemented without specialized equipment or industrial infrastructure. Most importantly, Tommy's legacy was a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources and that traditional knowledge, properly understood and applied, could provide solutions to modern problems that purely technological approaches might miss. The enduring lesson of resourceful adaptation. The broader significance of Tommy Rodriguez's story extends beyond food preservation to fundamental questions about innovation, cultural knowledge, and the relationship between traditional wisdom and modern problem-solving. Tommy had demonstrated that effective solutions often come from combining traditional techniques with modern applications rather than abandoning traditional methods in favor of purely contemporary approaches. His success required not just knowledge of traditional preservation techniques but also the ability to adapt those techniques to new scales, new requirements, and new conditions. Tommy had taken kitchen-scale family preservation methods and scaled them up to feed over 2,000 soldiers for 6 months under extreme conditions. This kind of adaptive innovation became increasingly important as military operations expanded into environments and situations where conventional solutions were inadequate or unavailable. Tommy's example showed that the most effective innovations often came from service members who brought diverse cultural backgrounds and practical experience to military challenges. The principles Tommy had applied, understanding the science behind traditional techniques, adapting methods to available resources, and maintaining quality control through practical testing, proved relevant to many fields beyond food preservation and military logistics. His story also illustrated the importance of recognizing and valuing the knowledge that service members brought from their civilian backgrounds and cultural traditions. Military effectiveness was enhanced not by standardizing all approaches but by leveraging the diverse capabilities and knowledge that different people contributed to common objectives. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy Rodriguez had shown that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most reliable ones, and that innovation often means rediscovering and adapting traditional knowledge rather than inventing entirely new approaches to old problems. So here's the question Tommy's story poses: in your own field, what traditional knowledge or proven techniques are you overlooking in favor of newer methods that might be less effective? What resources and capabilities do you have access to through your own background and experience that could provide innovative solutions to current challenges? And do you have the confidence to trust practical wisdom even when it contradicts conventional expertise? Tommy Rodriguez proved that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or research facilities, but from grandmothers' kitchens and family traditions that have been tested by generations of people who had to make them work or face the consequences. Sometimes the best technology is knowledge that has already proven itself through centuries of successful application.